Fusion is probably my favorite official 2D Metroid game. I know, I'm awful. Terrible. In 2002, Nintendo delivered not one, but two Metroid titles on the same day. Imagine that, after an 8-year Samusless void. This time though, Samus returned with a bang in the form of two truly unique games. Not only were they different from each other, but also a giant change from what the franchise had done before. Metroid Prime, a first-person adventure and our first look at an alien world from behind Samus's visor, developed by Austin, Texas's Retro Studios, and Fusion, the fourth entry in the main chronological timeline done by series veterans R&D1. Sure, this one is in the more traditional 2D style of past Metroid entries, but that's where the similarities end. Metroid Fusion is a brave, bold step in many different directions. The title font has changed, the introduction music is devoid of the traditional upbeat, heroic melody heard after the ambient intro. Instead, this new tune drops into a darker, eerie dirge. This music perfectly captures the overall tone of Metroid Fusion. We're in for something new. Now, that isn't to suggest that R&D1 completely turned the series on its head with this entry. Samus might not look the same in her pastel power suit, but she moves somewhat similarly to her former self from Super Metroid. Speaking of which, Fusion's intro is presented in a nearly identical style as its predecessor, a touch I really enjoy as someone who likes little continuity flourishes such as this. It makes Fusion feel like a proper sequel, which it is. While we're talking about story, the plot this time revolves around a planet's biological organisms being infected by X-parasites. Samus arrives with a small crew to survey the environment, only to be attacked by the virus which impacts her central nervous system and leaves her close to death. Scientists create a vaccine from the Metroid Samus adopted at the end of the second game, but the alien cells make her weak to cold. If you remember fighting the titular characters in past entries, this all makes canonical sense and is a great touch. I won't go too much deeper into it than that, but basically Samus is now operating with the DNA of a Metroid as well as that of the virus which allows her to absorb the X-parasites from enemies in order to power herself up. At the beginning of the game, she's weak, vulnerable to certain elements and enemies, as well as nearly entirely reliant on the computer system's guidance, which is a central operating system that takes a lot of characteristics of someone from Samus's past. Adam. One of the issues I have with the narrative is when Samus goes into her whiny, reflective inner monologues, specifically the ones regarding Adam. They aren't as insufferable as the ones from Other M, but in my eyes they do much more harm to her character than good. Samus is a badass in a spacesuit who has defeated some of the biggest threats in the galaxy on her own. Seeing her devolving into a sniveling little high school teen strips her of a certain degree of dignity.
Oh, I remember Adam. I wonder if he remembers me. What's he thinking about? Is it of me? Adam.
Oh, Sylvie, I can't stop thinking about Tony, wondering where I could be, who he is with, what is he thinking? Is he thinking of me? And whether he'll ever return someday?
Oh, Michelle. You have to stop lying awake wondering about Tony, wondering where he is, who he could be with, what he's thinking, if he's thinking of you, and whether he'll ever return one day.
Metroid Fusion is a much more linear affair than other games in the series, at least in the beginning. This might make me sound like a hypocrite to those who watched our Zero Mission review, since the Chozo paths were one of my criticisms there, but in Fusion, it works very well for a number of reasons. Firstly, the game is built around the narrative. The story is interesting, engaging, and well told. There's a horror element to the entire thing, which fits this series quite well. I mean, it was inspired by the Alien franchise of films, after all. I have no excuse for the insanely long, frequent dumps of expository text, but I'll say, it really isn't as bad as a lot of people make it out to be. Those who claim that this goes on until the very end simply haven't played Fusion to completion. It eases up on the prattling once the overall structural mechanics have been introduced, and becomes relegated to information stations next to save points, which is a great inclusion considering that this is a portable game. Meaning, if you only have a few minutes here and there to play Fusion sporadically, you always have a nice little reminder a short distance from your save point the next time you boot up. Now, you might be thinking, linearity in a Metroid game? Well, that sounds like the antithesis to the formula. Wait, Adam's here? What is this? Other M? The answer is sorta. Fusion feels like a predecessor to Other M in a lot of ways. There's a larger emphasis on action and a deliberate path of progression. Where this one differs is in the level design and challenge. Metroid Fusion might hold your hand at the beginning, but the deeper you dig into the world and story, the more interesting it gets. This is a tough game that feels much more like the original NES title than any others. Even with the direct paths presented, I found myself getting lost a lot in this one. Much more than Zero Mission, which I completed in only a few hours. Fusion is tricky in different ways. It makes you think a lot more. When the training wheels come off, they really expect the player to rely on their knowledge and skill. As I said, the deeper Samus digs, the darker it gets. Everything is out to get you, and in this world you can literally and figuratively feel the weight of the organic and mechanical life forms watching you, awaiting your demise. It's brilliantly terrifying, with the most impactful story beats occurring in-game, not through cutscenes or text scrawls. Metroid Fusion plays a lot of tricks on you with traps next to power-ups. It's a faster-paced action game overall, but during the puzzle sections, it expects you to take the time and pay attention to your surroundings. The levels are intricately, artistically designed to weave in and out, and each area has a fair share of secrets to explore and upgrades to obtain. Gaining these abilities unlocks Samus from all of the tiny prisons the game entraps her in. I keep saying this, but the latter portion of the game takes a sharp turn, both conceptually and structurally. It caught me off guard the first time I played Fusion, which was after I had just played Zero Mission. In past entries, Samus is a powerful protagonist ripping through organic, planetary puzzle environments. She is the hunter. In Fusion, the world is almost entirely crafted by humans and machinery. This place is cold, sterile, and artificial. The game compounds on this by showing living creatures from Samus's past, enslaved behind glass. They are being observed, possibly test subjects, probably worse. You, as Samus, feel like a zoo creature wandering around in an artificial habitat, encased in a hostile ant farm, a stark contrast to the control she had in other games. The world has changed. Despite the planet being the same, the mechanics have been tweaked to make Samus more agile, and many of the enemies are new as well. Let's dig into these parasites and baddies a bit. Enemies not only need to be eliminated, but absorbed. These parasitic remains offer up energy as a reward, but if you allow them to roam free, they have the opportunity to morph into a new, more powerful enemy. It is a drastic change in this series, and one that I absolutely love. There's a risk-reward system in place here that keeps the player on their toes, and with a much higher focus on combat overall, it keeps the game feeling engaging from start to finish. At times, other enemies will absorb the parasites, which in turn create mutations, which can be utilized as platforms later in the game. The environments change quite frequently as well, whether it be as a result of your doppelganger or other powers at hand. It keeps the player on edge, and it's perfectly implemented. I can't downplay how creepy it feels to think that you understand an area's layout, only to return to find it decimated by a mysterious force. Oftentimes, these changes are as a result of the SAX, a dark Samus before Prime 2's antagonist. You see, the X-Parasite has taken over your discarded spacesuit from the beginning of the game, and it's out to get you. Those of you who have watched our Zero Mission review will remember just how much I hated the shitty late-game stealth section. It nearly ruined the experience for me. Well, part of why that sequence bothers me so much is that it feels dumped on the player as a means of padding out the experience. It's jarring. Fusion handles this, countdown sequences, and bosses much better. But before we dig into the big bads, let's focus on the SAX. From the first time we meet our doppelganger, it's evident that she is quite capable of ending your life in your weakened state. These moments are genuinely terrifying and a true highlight in the series as a whole. The SAX is introduced to the player gradually, first in a horrific cutscene, then safely on the prowl. Finally, it's Samus vs. Samus, where you need to escape its terrifying lock on you. This is how you introduce a new mechanic to a beloved series. Not this. It's reminiscent of Nemesis from the Resident Evil series, but this is done a bit better. SAX is armed with all of the power-ups you, as Samus, had accumulated in Super Metroid, the previous 2D Metroid game. The only thing this clone can't do is climb, one of the few features our pastel-colored protagonist can achieve effortlessly thanks to Samus's lighter equipment load. This adds a bumped-up level of terror that this series needed. It's new, creative, and never gets old. From beginning to end, the SAX could be around any corner. There's a narrative reason it tries to block you from some areas, and it's a damned great plot device. The end connects the dots in a way that is a bit too familiar to past games, but I'll let you discover that on your own. Alright, so, the bosses. Metroid Fusion has the best designed, most challenging big bads in the entire 2D series. Nightmare is a highlight, but each and every one of them was a treat to combat. They are well designed both visually as well as mechanically, and the added theme of collecting parasites from them is rewarding. The linear structure of the game, and yes, I just said it again, allowed the developers to make each new foe a threat. They require Samus to use all her accumulated items as they aggressively try and take her down. This is a huge change over the ones from prior entries, as they needed to allow some wiggle room for sequence breaking. Not here. These baddies get harder and harder as the game goes on and are often placed close enough to save points that the run up to them is never arduous. Maneko Hamano and Akira Fujiwara did the score this time around, and it is mostly great. A lot of these compositions are some of the best in the series, but the Game Boy Advance's sound hardware makes a lot of it sound muffled and distorted. The music changes a lot throughout the areas and wonderfully complements the many set pieces throughout. Many of the tracks are short and loop quite frequently, which can grate on the ears in a few specific regions. Like the other components that make up Metroid Fusion, the soundtrack takes a lot of risks, and it largely pays off. Metroid Fusion is a fun game that retains the fundamental values of its predecessors. It's also vastly different than anything that came before it, with an emphasis on horrific set pieces and magnificent storytelling. The ending might be a tad derivative, but ultimately, this is one of my favorite entries in the series. It really feels like R&D 1 put their collective all into this thing, and for whatever reason, have abandoned anything that this game is. Nowadays, Samus gets tossed around from studio to studio. Maybe this was the last straw, the one that broke Nintendo's back and made them just stop trying. That's speculation, but I can see it. This game is an intricately woven web. Its follow-up was a return to the series' roots with sequence breaking, sure, but it has no heart. Fusion lacks any sort of path breaking. It follows a linear narrative and, as such, builds in difficulty. Samus isn't a glass cannon here, but she is definitely weaker. They address this in the story. She's pitted against her own sequence-breaking self, and weak against it. Metroid Fusion is growing from the carcass of its predecessors, or at least, it tried to. Metroid Fusion, Metroid Prime. 2002 was a great year for fans of this series. 2 phenomenal Metroid games released in one day. It's a thing of legend at a time like this where Nintendo can't seem to get Samus right. Still, all hail Nintendo. They can do no wrong. Make sure you flag this video as you normally do. Be swift. I deserve it with my 24 followers. All hail you and your Gestapo spirit.